Story 1. Summer nights in Florida hold a different kind of magic when you're 6 years old. I remember this particular evening in 1982 with the kind of clarity that only childhood memories seem to possess. The kind that stick with you not because you tried to remember them, but because they somehow became part of who you are. We were staying in a beachfront condo in Fort Walton Beach, one of those tall white buildings that line the Gulf Coast, like sentinels. The balcony overlooked the endless expanse of water, and at night, the sound of waves created a peaceful rhythm that made even adults believe in magic. My great-grandmother and I had claimed the balcony as our special place after dinner, where she would tell me stories about her childhood while we watched the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. The air was heavy with salt and the lingering warmth of a summer day. Inside, I could hear my mom and sister playing cards with my grandparents, their laughter drifting through the sliding glass door. My great-grandmother sat in one of those white plastic chairs, her hands folded in her lap, while I leaned against the railing, counting the lights of shrimp boats on the horizon. That's when everything changed. The boom came first, not the rolling rumble of normal thunder, but a sharp crack that seemed to split the sky. My great-grandmother's hand found my shoulder as we both looked up, expecting to see lightning dancing between the clouds. What we saw instead would remain unexplained for the next 40 years. The lights emerged from behind a bank of clouds, descending like falling stars that had forgotten to fall. There were several of them. I remember counting at least 5. Though they moved so fast it was hard to be sure. They weren't the steady lights of aircraft or the brief flash of shooting stars. These lights danced. They spun and wheeled through the sky like cosmic ballet dancers, leaving trails of luminescence in their wake that hung in the air for precious seconds before fading away. The colors were impossible to name. Sometimes white, sometimes golden, sometimes something in between that made my eyes hurt if I tried to focus too hard. They moved with impossible precision, chasing each other in tight spirals and sudden turns that should have torn any normal aircraft apart. Each new maneuver was accompanied by complete silence. No jet engines, no sonic booms, just the constant rhythm of waves below. My great-grandmother's grip on my shoulder tightened slightly. "Do you see that?" she whispered, though whether she was asking me or herself, I'm still not sure. I nodded, unable to look away from the aerial display above us. For what felt like both an eternity and mere seconds, we watched these mysterious visitors perform their silent dance over the Gulf. Other balconies had come alive with witnesses. I remember hearing gasps and exclamations in the darkness, seeing the silhouettes of people pointing skyward. A group had gathered on the beach below, their faces illuminated by the strange lights above. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the lights changed direction. They moved in perfect unison, ascending at an impossible angle back into the cloud bank they'd emerged from. The last thing we saw was their glow illuminating the clouds from above before disappearing completely, leaving behind only questions and the sound of waves. My great-grandmother never spoke about what we saw that night, not even when I brought it up years later. She would just smile that knowing smile of hers, pat my hand, and change the subject. She passed away the following year, taking whatever thoughts she had about that evening with her. I've often wondered how many other people remember that night. There must have been dozens of witnesses. The hotel was full, the beach had been crowded with evening walkers, and the lights had been impossible to miss. Yet in all the years since, I've never read any reports or heard any stories about strange lights over Fort Walton Beach in the summer of '82. Sometimes, on warm summer nights when the air feels heavy with possibility, I find myself drawn to balconies and beaches. I look up at the clouds, half expecting to hear that sharp crack of thunder without rain, to see those mysterious lights return to perform their cosmic ballet. They never do, of course, but the memory of that night remains as clear as ever, a reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary moments are shared in silence with those we love, watching impossible things dance across the sky. My great-grandmother left me many things: her stories, her quiet wisdom, her way of finding magic in ordinary moments. But perhaps her greatest gift was being there with me that night, her hand on my shoulder as we witnessed something that defied explanation. Her presence validated what I saw, turned what could have been dismissed as a child's imagination into something real and shared. These days, when I watch the night sky with my own children, I think about that evening on the balcony. I think about the things we see but can't explain, and about how sometimes the most important part of witnessing something extraordinary isn't understanding it, but simply having someone beside you who sees it too. Story 2. It started as one of those stupid ideas you only get when you're young and half drunk. The three of us, me, Dave, and Marcus, had scored a couple six-packs and decided that drinking them in some suburban backyard wasn't adventurous enough. No, we needed something more epic. That's when I remembered the cave in Shadow Valley. "It'll be like those cave parties in high school," I said, conveniently forgetting how those usually ended with someone's parents getting called. Marcus was hesitant. "I don't know, man. You know how I feel about—" He trailed off, but we all knew what he meant. Ever since he was a kid, Marcus had been terrified of aliens. Not the fun E.T. kind, the abducting, probing, cattle-mutilating kind. Usually we gave him hell about it, but tonight his fear just made the adventure seem more exciting. The trail to the cave wasn't exactly well-maintained. Thorny vines and low-hanging branches turned it into an obstacle course, made worse by the fact that we only had one flashlight between us. The clouds had rolled in thick, blocking even the faintest starlight. The darkness felt alive, pressing against the beam of our light like a living thing. We weren't making it any easier on ourselves. Dave kept disappearing into the bushes and jumping out with his best alien impression. I'd whisper, "Did you hear that?" every few minutes, making Marcus jump. The beer in our systems made everything funnier than it should have been, our laughter echoing through the trees. Then we came to the tunnel. It wasn't a real tunnel, just a section of trail where the branches had grown so thick they formed a natural corridor. Dave went first with the flashlight, crawling on his hands and knees. Marcus followed, muttering something about how this was exactly how horror movies started. I brought up the rear, trying not to think about spiders. Halfway through, Dave suddenly stopped. The flashlight slipped from his hand, its beam spinning crazily before going dark. "What the fuck?" His whisper carried more terror than any scream. "Move, man." Marcus pushed forward, shoving Dave out of the tunnel. I scrambled after them, my heart pounding. As I emerged into the clearing, I saw them both standing perfectly still, heads tilted back, faces illuminated by an eerie glow. 3 lights hung in the darkness above us. They were perfectly circular, a brilliant white yellow that seemed to pierce the very air. They formed an exact triangle, completely motionless in the sky. No sound, no movement, just 3 impossible lights floating in the middle of nowhere. "We need to run," Marcus whispered, but none of us moved. I'd always wondered why people in horror movies just stood there when faced with danger. Now I knew. Fear has a way of short-circuiting your brain, leaving you frozen while your mind tries to process something it was never designed to understand. The lights cast strange shadows on the ground, making the familiar shapes of trees and rocks seem alien and threatening. Time seemed to stop existing. We could have been standing there for minutes or hours. None of us could have said for sure. It was Dave who finally broke the spell. Maybe it was the beer wearing off, or maybe just desperate curiosity, but he took a step forward, then another. Marcus and I followed, drawn forward like moths to these impossible flames. That's when we saw it. The bridge. It spanned the valley about 50 feet above us, its concrete supports, almost invisible in the darkness. 3 street lamps lined its length, their lights perfectly positioned to create the illusion we'd seen from below. In the pitch black, with no reference points and alcohol-addled brains, we'd completely missed the structure itself. We stood there for a long moment, relief and embarrassment washing over us in equal measure. Then Dave started laughing, a slightly hysterical sound that quickly infected all of us. We laughed until our sides hurt, the kind of laughter that comes when fear transforms into foolishness. I can't believe we thought. Marcus wiped tears from his eyes. Man, I was ready to get probed. We did make it to the cave eventually, though our night of partying had taken on a different tone. We spent hours talking about how completely convinced we'd been, how real it had seemed. The beer probably didn't help, but there was something more to it. A glimpse into how easily our minds can transform the ordinary into the extraordinary when given the right circumstances. Years later, whenever we get together, someone inevitably brings up the alien lights. We laugh about it now, but there's always a moment when the laughter dies down, and we remember that feeling, that pure, primal fear of something beyond our understanding. And sometimes, just sometimes, I wonder if maybe we were right to be afraid. Not of aliens, but of how easily our perception of reality can be warped by darkness, fear, and 3 perfectly positioned street lamps. The bridge is still there, its lights still shining over Shadow Valley. Sometimes I drive out there late at night, park my car, and walk that overgrown trail. The lights look different now, their mundane purpose clear in the context of the bridge. But on cloudy nights, when the darkness is complete and the lights seem to float in void, I can still feel that moment of terror and wonder when 3 drunk guys believed, just for a moment, that they weren't alone in the universe. Story 3. Some childhood memories feel more like half-remembered dreams, existing in that hazy space between imagination and reality. But what I saw that night in 1987 has stayed with me for over 30 years, painted in colors that time hasn't managed to fade. I was 9 years old, sleeping in what used to be our garage before Dad converted it into my bedroom. It was my own personal space, complete with windows on 3 sides and glow-in-the-dark stars stuck to the ceiling, my attempt to bring the universe a little closer. The neighborhood was typical suburban America, neat rows of houses, carefully trimmed lawns, and streets that felt safe enough for kids to ride their bikes until the streetlights came on. That night, something pulled me from sleep. Not a sound, exactly, but a presence, the way you can feel someone watching you even with your eyes closed. When I opened them, the entire room was bathed in an impossible shade of green. The light pulsed gently, casting shadows that seemed to dance across my model airplanes and Star Wars posters. It came through all 3 windows at once, so bright that it turned my white curtains into shifting emerald screens. The color wasn't harsh like the fluorescent lights at school, but soft and almost liquid, as if the air itself had turned to green water. I sat up in bed, my Care Bear's comforter sliding to the floor unnoticed. Outside my window, hovering above Mrs. Peterson's maple tree, was something that shouldn't exist outside of movies and comic books. A UFO, not some vague lights in the sky or a strange shape in the darkness, but a classic flying saucer, like something straight out of Close encounters of the third kind. It was massive, filling my entire field of vision through the windows. The surface seemed to shift and ripple, covered in patterns that my eyes couldn't quite follow. The green light emanated from a ring of what looked like windows or portholes around its circumference, pulsing in a rhythm that felt almost like a heartbeat. There was a sound, too, though calling it a sound doesn't quite capture it. It was more like a vibration that existed somewhere between hearing and feeling. A low musical hum that made the glass in my windows resonate ever so slightly. The tone seemed to bypass my ears entirely and speak directly to something deep in my brain, holding me transfixed. I don't remember being scared. Instead, I felt a profound sense of wonder, the kind that only children can experience without questioning it. Time seemed to stop as I watched the green light paint my room in impossible shadows. The glow-in-the-dark stars on my ceiling seemed to pulse in response to the ship's rhythm, as if engaged in some sort of cosmic conversation. The next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through my windows. My alarm clock showed 7:23 a.m., its red digits seeming somehow ordinary after the otherworldly green of the night before. The maple tree outside stood unchanged, its leaves gently stirring in the morning breeze. There were no scorch marks on the lawn, no mysterious circles in Mrs. Peterson's flower beds, nothing to suggest that anything extraordinary had happened. At breakfast, Mom complained about Mr. Wilson's dog barking all night, and Dad read the morning paper with its mundane headlines about local politics and high school football scores. No one mentioned seeing strange lights or hearing unusual sounds. Later that day, I rode my bike around the neighborhood, looking for anyone else who might have witnessed what I saw. But it was just another summer morning in suburban America, with sprinklers ticking away on perfectly normal lawns under a perfectly normal sky. I never told anyone about what I saw that night. Even then I understood that it was probably just a dream, one of those vivid, hyper-real dreams that children sometimes have. But dream or not, it changed something in me. Every night after that, I would look out my windows before going to sleep, hoping to see that gentle green glow again. I became fascinated with space and science fiction, devouring books about astronomy and filling notebooks with drawings of what I'd seen. Now, decades later, I sometimes find myself waking in the middle of the night, half expecting to see my bedroom bathed in that ethereal green light. It never is, of course, but the memory remains as vivid as ever. I've since moved away from that suburban neighborhood, and the garage-turned-bedroom has probably been converted back by new owners who never knew about the night it was visited by something extraordinary. Sometimes I wonder about that night, whether it was truly just a dream, or if perhaps something magical really did visit a 9-year-old's bedroom in suburban America. I suppose it doesn't really matter. What matters is how it made me feel, that sense of wonder, of possibilities beyond the ordinary, of a universe far stranger and more beautiful than we imagine. My own children now have glow-in-the-dark stars on their ceilings, and sometimes when I tuck them in at night, I catch myself glancing out their windows, hoping that maybe, just maybe, they'll get to experience their own moment of wonder in the green light of something extraordinary. Story 4. Silent Visitor. I never told many people about what happened that summer evening when I was 14. The few times I tried, they'd smile politely or change the subject. Sometimes they'd joke about how kids have wild imaginations. But Melissa was there too, and so was Mom. They saw it. They remember. Our house sat on a gentle slope overlooking Henderson Bay, where the water stretched out like dark glass beneath the twilight sky. That evening, Melissa and I were sprawled on the sectional sofa, watching some forgotten show while Mom prepared dinner in the kitchen. The golden hour was fading into dusk, and through the bay windows I could see the first stars beginning to pierce the darkening blue. That's when we noticed the lights. At first they seemed innocent enough. Strange purplish-pink illuminations rising above the tree line across the water. But something about their movement felt wrong. Too precise. Too deliberate. "Katie," Melissa whispered, her hand gripping my arm. "What is that?" I felt my mouth go dry. My older sister had always been obsessed with aliens, plastering her bedroom walls with newspaper clippings about UFO sightings and abduction stories. I'd absorbed her fascination unwillingly, through osmosis, but it had manifested as pure terror. All those nights I'd lie awake, imagining silent watchers in the dark. The lights grew larger, closer. They weren't blinking like aircraft lights should. Instead, they pulsed with an inner radiance that seemed to bend the air around them. "Mom," I called out, my voice cracking. "Mom, you need to see this." She must have heard the fear in my voice because she came running. The three of us stood at the window, watching as the impossible thing approached. It moved with glacial deliberation, as if time itself had thickened around it. That's when the silence fell. It wasn't just quiet. It was an absolute void of sound. The constant hum of traffic from Miller Road vanished. The neighbor's dog stopped barking. Even the persistent whisper of wind through the trees died away. The silence had weight, presence. It pressed against my eardrums like cotton wool. The object now hung directly above our house, close enough that I could see its surface, geometric patterns etched into what looked like brushed steel, illuminated by those ethereal lights. It was massive, nearly half the length of a football field, with a rectangular shape that defied aerodynamics. Dark windows or ports ran along its length, but they revealed nothing of what might lie behind them. Mom fumbled for the phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed 911. I could hear her voice, unnaturally loud in the silence, describing what we were seeing. The operator's response was lost beneath the thundering of my own heartbeat. Minutes stretched like hours as we stood frozen, three small figures beneath that impossible machine. I remember thinking about all those stories my sister had told me, about people who vanished in the night, about lost time and returned memories. But the craft made no attempt to communicate or interfere. It simply watched, hovering with impossible stillness. Then, as silently as it had arrived, it began to move again. The motion was smooth, deliberate, as it glided toward the lights of downtown. As it retreated, sound rushed back into the world like a breaking wave. Cars, dogs, wind, all the normal noises we never notice until they're gone. Later, the local news would dismiss it as space debris, as if space debris could hover and move with intelligent purpose, as if space debris could silence the world. Mom still has the recording of her 911 call, and sometimes when people don't believe me, I'm tempted to play it for them, but I never do, because the truth is, I don't need them to believe me. I know what we saw that night, what hung above our house in impossible silence. Sometimes, on quiet nights when I visit home, I still find myself looking up at the stars through those bay windows, waiting, wondering if it's watching, even now. And I wonder if next time it might do more than just observe, and just observe, and just observe, and just